Next learning objective is static and flexible budgets. So let's start with static. Static are based on original operating budgets, and it's constant regardless of the actual activity. Activity here would be something like units sold if you're a product-based company. Flex budget, to contrast it, would be it's set over various sales volumes, and we set it for one estimated level of production. And then we look at what would be the cost at that activity level. Specifically, we break out the variable and fixed costs so that as the actual unit volume changes, we can reflect that in the budget. So that's why we call it flex. The fixed costs do not flex. The variable costs do flex based on the actual units. So let's do an example. So Langley Hats has scheduled to make 800 sun hats for July. And the costs are as follows: direct material, 1.2 yards at $3 per yard, direct labor at 0.15 hours at $12 an hour, variable overhead at 0.515 labor hours at $16.50 per hour, and then fixed overhead of $2,100 a month. What we can do is create a static budget using this very simple data. So let's do that. Back in Excel, go to the Static versus Flex tab. Here I just carried forward the information summarized in Excel, and we're going to start with creating a budget. So 800 units, and the direct material is for 800. Factor for units is in material would be 1.2 yards. Labor would be 0.15 hours, and for variable 0.15 hours as well. And the units of resource is, well, that's 800 times 1.2, and so copy that. This means 960 yards of fabric, 120 hours of direct labor, and 120 hours worth of overhead. The unit is the cost per yard, $3, the cost per hour, $12, or the allocation rate per hour, $16.50. So now we can get to dollar budget. If we use 960 yards times $3 a yard, that would cost us $2,880. If we use 120 hours and the hourly rate is 12, it'll be $14.40. If we use 120 hours times the allocation rate of $16.50, we use $19.80 of variable overhead. So now we have a variable cost. So this here, fixed cost, $2,100. So the total cost is $8,400. So now I can highlight this as the static budget. Next, we're given the actuals. The scheduled production was 800. We actually produced 850, and we had direct costs of this amount, labor, etc., etc. So I'm going to copy it into Excel. It's right here. This is a very important factor, is 900. But for static, we ignore it. That's what's wrong with static. We have direct material 3087, and then we have direct labor 1547, and we have variable overhead 2185, and we have overhead of 2090. So total cost is this. So the variance. Notice that in costing, we want lower costs. So when we do a variance, we generally like a negative sign to signify unfavorable. So since we like lower cost, so this equals budget minus actual. So if it's negative, that means we spent more money than our budget. We'll do that as well here. So budget minus actual. Negative means, which means we spent more money on labor. Same thing on overhead, budget minus actual, which means we spent more money on overhead. In total, the variable cost, we spent $500 more than budget. Budget minus actual. Overhead, we saved $10 over fixed budget. Overall, we're negative 509, so this is unfavorable. Should you get fired? If you think about it, should you get fired? Well, here's what the big insight is. We estimated originally to be at 800. We ended up making 900. So if I'm the production manager, I'm not very happy that you're holding me to a budget that was predicated on making 800 instead when the actuals were 900. I don't like to be judged by a static budget. So that's what happens. It would lead to a conclusion that I spent more than was budgeted, therefore I went over budget. Now let's do flex. Flex budget is a variation of what we just did. So watch how this works. You see how we have units produced, but instead of putting 800, I'm putting 900. So I'm going to hold that number as my base for all the variable elements of the budgeted number. The basic idea is we use actual units based on the budgeted per unit variable costs. That's kind of the insight. The next part is the same, where our standards are the same. The formulas here are the same too. What we're saying is that if we made 900 units and we expect 1.2 yards per unit, then we should use 1080 units or yards of fabric. And the fabric cost should be $3, which means we should have spent 1080 times $3. Same thing with labor. We are expected to spend $12. If we spend $12 times number of hours, we would spend $16.20. Same thing with overhead. If we're expecting 650 times 135, it should be 2228. So the sum is 7080. Actuals are identical. We still spent 3087 for material, 1547 for labor, and 2185 for overhead. So the sum is the same as above of 6819. Overhead that we expected was fixed, so it's the same. We expected 2100. The total should have been 9188. The overhead was 2090. That again didn't change. And that total, drum roll please, is 8909. We use the same approach of budget minus actual, and I'll just copy it this time. Instead of having a bunch of negative, unfavorable signs, these are all favorable. We used less material, less labor, less overhead than we anticipated. Since we were at 900, we made 100 extra units. We're actually under on a flex basis. Overhead, we saved $10, so that's nice too. But every single number is a positive, whereas above, most numbers were negatives. Where this looked unfavorable, like you're not doing a good job, here this would be favorable. Favorable. And means you should get a bonus. You went from getting fired to getting a bonus because we used a flex budget, which is more fair, versus static budget, which is having you make 900 units for the same amount of money you thought it would take to make 800 units, right? It makes no sense. I'll box this just to finish it out. But you see the point is that static has a set of numbers for budget, and regardless of the volume you produced, you're held to it. Whether it's high or low, make you look good when you shouldn't be good, may make you look bad when you shouldn't look bad. Flex is better because it flexes the variable portions of the budget so that your benchmark is given how much you should have spent at the volume that you actually produced. We matched the 900 in the budget to the 900 we actually did, so that the amount of money you spent is based on the relationship of variable and fixed costs. It's far superior to a static budget. Static versus flexible. Static is useful to see how close we are to what we initially projected. It's kind of accountability. However, to assess the ability to manage costs, the flex budget should be used since it is more accurate and it separates the fixed and variable costs and flexes based on the actual units sold by the company. So it's a far better measure of cost management than a static budget. Next, we move into standard costing, which is a key tool in management accounting. And it's what we look at, how much should it cost us for either buying material or for direct labor or overhead. We're going to do it based on some historical analysis, some engineering analysis to see what should things cost us. This is important because we're probably going to use that data to determine how to price our product. when we look at this idea of standards, sometimes we want tight standards, which create stretch goal to make people manage to it. But what happens is that you might have people give up on it, that it's too hard to attain. And so people would end up buffering their budgets in order to create themselves some slack.